So I'm always trying to respond to the requests you make in the comments section down below. And one of you had asked that I do a video about inflation and why we're having so much of it right now. So today's video is all about inflation. Everything you always wanted to know about inflation, but were afraid to ask. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So just so you know, my PhD is actually in business management and business strategy. But business strategy as a field is heavily influenced by economics, and I've actually had to take a lot of economics training at the graduate level as part of my training to become a business professor. And in fact, I've had enough economics training that I'm actually qualified to teach economics classes to some undergraduates. And at a university prior to the one where I'm teaching now, I had actually taught economics as one of my subjects. So I'm going to give you a very basic primer about what inflation is and why I think that we're dealing with it today. And I'm going to kind of touch on some of the different theories, because the truth of the matter is we're having inflation now for a variety of reasons that are all happening at the same time. And nobody's really sure which of them is precisely the one that's most to blame for the problem. So I'm just going to switch our screen over here so that we can have a bit of a whiteboard where we can where I can draw some charts, because you know how economists love to have charts. And I'm going to draw here a supply, why isn't this working? Aha, okay. The basic supply and demand curve. Now, some of you may have actually seen this before in your economics classes, but basically, of course, here we have money, and here we have quantity. You have to forgive me for my drawing. My students are well aware of my inability to draw just about anything, but such it is. Okay, so supply generally goes up. That's supply. Demand generally curves down. Now that makes sense, right? Oh, geez, I'm not doing a very good job here. Okay, that makes sense because of the fact that as something costs more, there's going to be less people are going to want to buy it, right? So the demand curve goes down because as something costs more, as the price goes up, there's going to be less quantity demanded, right? At the same time, the suppliers, the more that, the higher the price is, the more that they're going to want to supply. So the supply curve goes up, where the higher the price, the more there's going to be a supply. Now, the place where these two curves meet is called the equilibrium. And that's basically the market set price, where basically the sellers and the buyers have essentially agreed in an open market where you have the ability to negotiate freely as to the price of goods and services, the fair price that everybody agrees that a certain good or service is worth. Now, you might be wondering why I'm starting with such a basic concept. When we're talking about inflation, it seems totally unrelated to the supply and demand curve. But in fact, it has everything to do with the supply and demand curve. And in a world where so many of the markets that we're dealing with are imperfect markets, what economists call examples of market failure, where because of, say, consolidation of a certain industry, that one side of the bargaining equation has much more power than the other side of the bargaining equation. Like, for example, I would say the labor market right now is not really a fair market. Right now, there's been so much consolidation among employers, and they have so much power, and employees really are weakened by the lack of labor unions and the fact that they don't have the ability to move wherever they want. They have skills that might not be substitutable for one another. You know, you can't just substitute one person for another. So as a result of that, the labor market is actually an example of what I would consider market failure that really needs to be corrected by government intervention. That's my view. Not all economists agree with that. But certainly most economists would agree on two markets that are directly relevant to that, and that's the market for money and the market for oil. Two markets that are going to be critical to our discussion about inflation today. Now let's start with this. You might say the market for money? Mike, what in the world are you talking about? Well, let me ask you a basic question, and this might seem like a basic question, but it's a question that virtually everybody gets wrong. In fact, I can tell you I got it wrong until I went to graduate school. And the question is this: who makes money? Like, who actually creates money? Everybody will typically say it's the government, or it's the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, something like that. And the reality is none of those make money. Let me give you an example of how money is created. Okay, let's go back to a blank board here because I want to talk to you about how money is created. And just think about this. So let's just say that I buy something from you, and as a result, I give you, whoops, oh, I need to get the pencil going here. Okay, I need to give you $1 or €1, doesn't matter. Same principle. But since we're here in the United States, we're going to talk in terms of dollars. So what do I do with my dollar? Well, I deposit it in the bank. So the bank now has my dollar, right? So $1 sitting in the bank. Now, what's the bank going to do with that dollar? They're just going to hold on to that dollar forever just in case I want to take it out at some point? Well, the answer is, of course, no. And everybody knows this. What the bank's going to do is they're going to lend it out. They're going to lend out another dollar, right? And by the way, I can already hear some people there are going to start telling me, oh, I'm oversimplifying, or oh, there's, other issues here. And don't worry, I'm going to get to that. But let's just start with the most basic model here to kind of explain how it works. So all of a sudden so my bank account, though, is still showing that I have $1 in the bank. But they lent out $1, and that person now is going to deposit that dollar into their bank account. Okay, I'll just put a B there because you can see how good I am at writing these things. So all of a sudden, this $1 that I got when you bought something from me has turned into $1 in this bank, showing in this bank account, and $1 showing in this bank account. Suddenly, this $1 has turned into $2. So what's going to happen with this bank? Well, they're going to lend out this dollar as well. Don't worry, I'm not going to go for this forever. And that, of course, gets deposited to another bank. And in this way, $1 becomes $3. So that's actually how we create money. And you have to understand, the vast majority of dollars out there are electronic. Yes, the Treasury Department will actually print the dollar bills that some of us might have actually carried in our wallets at one point in our lives. But as of right now, most money is electronic. They're just like ones and zeros in the computer systems of banks. So this is how money gets made, is it gets basically deposited into a bank account and then lent out again. Now, obviously, what happens is the bank doesn't lend out the entire dollar that it was given, because of the fact that then what happens if some percentage of the people who gave the bank money want to come out and withdraw their money, the bank needs to have a certain amount of money on hand that it's able to hold on to, and that we call the reserve. There must be an easier way to do this. So the bank has the requirement of a reserve. So it only holds on to a certain percentage of the money that it needs. So it's able to, in case some percentage of people want to withdraw their money at the same time, that it has that amount of money on hand, but the rest of it can lend out. Now, when more people want to take their money out than the bank has on hand, that's what we call a run on the bank. And that's what happens what happened actually in the Great Depression is essentially what happened in the Great Recession that we had in 2008, except that because most banks that we deal with have insurance for that through either the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or there's also one for the Savings and Loans, the SIC, I think, or and then there's also one for credit unions. Even if they do end up running out of money because so many people are withdrawing money from their accounts, this insurance company steps in to protect it. But in 2008, what happened is essentially we'd had what they called a shadow banking system develop. And that's actually what collapsed. And it was a classic run on the bank that we had back then with the shadow banking system. If you're interested in a video on that someday, I'd be happy to do it for you. But at any rate, in this case, though, we're just talking about your normal banks. And so the normal bank is going to hold on to its reserve. And let's just say that as its reserve, it has to hold on to 10%. So then, instead of lending out $1, they would have lent out 90 cents. So all of a sudden, this dollar turns into $1.90, right? So this bank now has 90 cents, and they can only lend out 10% of that. So what are they going to lend out? Well, they're going to lend out 81 cents. Okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see how this goes down the line. So each time it gets lent, it's each time that it goes through the process of going through a bank, slightly less gets lent out. But still, you can see how money is essentially increasing as it goes through this process of being deposited and lent out again. So that's actually how our system creates money. Now, when you hear about the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, one of the most common mistakes I see in the newspapers again and again and again is that they talk about the Fed, when they're adjusting their interest rates, that they're going to change the federal funds rate or the federal discount rate. And that is incorrect. And basically, you would have to find someone who has graduate training in economics, or you or someone who's taken one of my classes, who'd be able to correctly point that out, which is that the discount rate actually is slightly higher than the market rate, the market interest rate. And the market interest rate, of course, is set by this process here, with people lending money out, and it has everything to do with supply and demand. Remember a supply and demand curve. We've got the, if there is more money, let me just see here if I can come back to this. So that brings us back to the supply and demand curve, where of course we have, again, the price and the quantity. And this is true for money, where basically, so you've got the supply curve, right? The demand curve, right? Okay, so this is true for money, where if there's more money in the system, then they're able to charge more to lend out their money than if there's less money available to be lent out, right? And you might say, wait a minute, lending out money, what's the price to lend out money? That is the interest rate. The interest rate is essentially the price that banks charge to lend out money. So that gets set in an open market the same way that, again, the price of oil is set, actually. And it involves millions of transactions every single day between banks all over the world. It's way too large a market for anybody to try to exert any kind of control over it. So it's a true free market where the price is determined based upon the interaction of millions of buyers and sellers on a daily basis. Now, how does the Federal Reserve impact this? Well, the Federal Reserve impacts this and changes the inflation rate by essentially, and again, I'm oversimplifying, so if you're an economics expert, please forgive me here, but essentially what they do is that they're able to engage in certain kind of transactions with the banks that result in the banks having less money to lend out. Essentially, they make it so that the bank has to keep more money on reserve and can't lend out as much money as they would have. In that way, they reduce the money supply. They reduce the amount of money that's available to be lent out. And as a result, money gets more expensive. That's raising the interest rate. So that is essentially what you're seeing the Fed doing right now, as they're raising interest rates to try to slow down the economy, to try to get rid of inflation. Now, you might say right now, well, what does this have to do with the fact that we have so much inflation now? But it has everything to do with it, because of the fact that you have to remember something. During this recession as a result of COVID right now, there were 3 pieces of legislation that were passed by Congress that were signed by the president. I think 2 of them by Trump and 1 of them by Biden, which resulted in money being essentially injected into the system to help us survive the COVID recession. Now, part of the reason that we were so aggressive about inserting money into the system in response to this COVID crisis was because of the experience that we had back in 2008, where frankly most economists, myself included, agree that we were too slow to inject money into the economy, that we were too timid in terms of putting money into the economy. And that's part of the reason why the economy took so long to bounce back. And we had this jobless recovery that people talked about. And it literally took years for the economy to come back to the level that it was prior to the economic crash, the financial crash. Well, in this case, what we did instead is we made the decision we're going to try to come back as quickly as possible. And by God, we did it. The bounce back from this recession was absolutely ridiculous how fast it was. It was so fast that literally businesses weren't able to respond to the demand for supplies that people wanted. We'll get back to that in a minute too. So on the one hand, you have people who were given all this money. What does that mean? Well, there was more money in the system, right? More money available. What does that do? Okay, what's going to happen is as there's more money, we're going to shift the supply curve over so that there's more quantity. Okay, and what does that do? Well, all of a sudden, that shifts the equilibrium level down. The value of money goes down. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, that should mean that, well, I don't know what you would say that would mean, but I can tell you that as a result of the value of money going down now, you're able to buy less with the money you have. So that's the first piece of inflation here, which is you have more money in the system as a result of these investments that were made by the government to try to stave off the recession that resulted from the COVID crisis. And as a result of that, the value of the money went down. You were able to, and that in and of itself is going to create inflationary pressures. And in fact, there were warnings by a number of people that inflation was a risk as a result of those investments that were being made in the economy. The most prominent of those probably is Larry Summers, who was Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, but it wasn't universal. And it's a challenge because, as we know, economics, despite the fact that we try to make it seem like it's mathematical here, and believe me, when you're studying economics, you need to learn a lot of math, but it's an imperfect science because you're dealing with people here. And so trying to peg what exactly is the right amount of investment for us to avoid a serious recession while still avoiding inflation, it's hard to put your finger on exactly what that number is going to be. And in this case, the lawmakers made a decision, which I agree with, by the way, that we would rather overinvest and make sure that people weren't hurt as a result of the COVID recession, even if it means that it risks inflation. Well, that's what we got. I mean, as it turns out, people actually ended the COVID recession wealthier than they were prior to COVID. It actually did not hurt people's finances the way, say, the recession in 2008 did. But, of course, it resulted in inflation. So that's one explanation as to why we have inflation right now, which is that there was so much money out and about that it made the money itself worth less, which then led to inflation. Okay, so that's the first idea of what caused inflation. The second idea has to do with oil. Whoa. Let me just deal with this here. I want to make sure you can see everything I'm doing here. Because, of course, we know these are pearls of wisdom and you don't want to miss any of them. So, once again, you've got the supply and demand curves. Okay. And here is supply. And here is demand. All right, very good. Okay, so now let's talk about oil. Now, the number of reasons why the situation at the gas pump is a mess right now are too many to enumerate. But I'm going to focus on probably the biggest one, which is that starting in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, the United States shifted from being a country that was a net importer of oil to being a net exporter of oil. And this is the first time that had happened in, I believe, since the 1960s. And that had to do with the changes in technology that allowed us to essentially bring more oil and gas out of the ground from wells that had already been essentially fully used up. So the oil companies, prior to the COVID recession, they were doing quite well. And in fact, there was a peak of real oil prices, a peak actually which we haven't reached yet. So all this talk about, oil prices are historically high, that's actually not true. The historic height of oil price was actually right about the time of the Great Recession, which is part of the reason the Great Recession was so bad. And the oil prices were incredibly high then. And actually, they were higher then on a real basis than they have ever reached during this period we're in right now. But that being said, oil prices are high. I get it. I'm with you. That sucks. But what happened is the oil companies were doing fine, and they were getting back money, pretty decent returns on their investment. And so they continued to invest in more and more extraction of fuel. And you may recall, for example, there was the talk about the pipeline that was going to be built from Canada down to Louisiana, and there was a big debate about it. And the reason that they wanted to make this investment is because of the fact that oil companies were making money. But then what happened is you had the COVID recession hit, and literally the price of oil went down to zero per barrel for a period. It was absolutely ridiculous because people just weren't using oil. We were producing all this oil and nobody was buying it. So again, based on the supply and demand curve, what happens if demand is low, then that's going to shift the demand curve back this way. And you can see all of a sudden the price goes way down from where it was before. So as a result of this, the oil companies actually lost about $76 billion during the COVID recession. Now, I know oil companies suck. I agree with you. I hate oil companies as much as the next guy. I hate them almost as much as I hate insurance companies. But the reality here, as much as there has been some consolidation in the oil industry, with the exception of OPEC, nobody controls enough of the capacity to be able to really set prices. This is a situation where, like with the interest rates, that it's set by a pure market, where you have enough people bargaining on either side of the bargaining equation that they really don't have the ability to set prices. Now, I know that this is a talking point that people love, that, the oil companies need to be subject to a tax for them getting all these excess profits. And I hate to say that I disagree with my colleagues on that point. There is a place for greed, don't get me wrong, we'll get to that in a little bit. But at least when it comes to oil, the reality is that the oil companies lost a boatload of money as a result of the COVID recession. And as a result now that the demand for oil has gone back up, the demand curve has shifted back over here, taking the price back up. The oil companies have not wanted to increase production again because they had the experience of taking that money coming in, investing it in production, and then as a result of that, losing their shirts. So instead, what they've done is that the supply has shifted left to be less quantity. And you can see what that does is that then drives the price even higher. So the price of oil, more than anything, has been impacted by the fact that the oil companies lost a boatload of money as a result of the recession. Demand went to zero. It went back up then through the roof almost immediately as a result of the rapid bounce back we had from the recession. And as a result of that, the oil companies are hesitant to invest into new drilling for fear that if they do that, then there's going to be another price drop and they're going to lose their shirts again. So they'd rather just kind of give returns to their shareholders. So that's what's driving the price of oil up. Now, there are other factors that are driving the price of oil up, no doubt about it. Certainly, the war in Ukraine has had an impact. The sanctions against Russia have an impact. OPEC has not exactly been forthcoming in terms of pumping more oil. I did do another video on that, and I'll link to that at the end here where I talk about that. But the bottom line is that the price of oil has gone up And as a result of that, the price of just about everything that we do has gone up. Now, here's the thing. Some people might say, oh, but the preferred measure that the Fed uses does not include oil. And you'd be right, does not include energy price. They actually strip that out. But the fact is, energy prices affect everything. They impact the prices of food because it has to be transported from place to place. They impact the price of any goods that have to be transported from place to place. Many plastics are made from either oil or from natural gas, so from petrochemicals of one kind. So anything with plastic in it is going to be impacted by the price of oil and gas. The two are linked, by the way, because, of course, as the price of oil goes up, what's going to happen then is that more energy generation, where they can shift over to natural gas, then they'll shift over to that, which will then drive that price up as well. So you can see how the price of oil affects everything. So that's been driving up prices. And in fact, the biggest increases in inflation, some of the biggest increases of inflation have been in energy, which is obvious right here, food, which I'll also get to, and transportation. Transportation, which is largely driven by oil, of course. Okay. Now let's get to the next reason that we have inflation. Food. Again, supply and demand curve. So one of the largest suppliers of wheat in the world is, you guessed it, Ukraine. In fact, between Ukraine and Russia, they supply, I think, about 40% of the world's wheat, so a very significant portion. And that wheat has largely been abandoned at this point. And as a result of that, the supply curve for food we're facing a food shortage, actually, in large parts of the country. So the supply curve has been shifted to the left, where quantity has gone down, okay? And what that does is that drives up the price again. So more than anything, in addition to, of course, the impact of the energy prices on the price of food, certainly the war in Ukraine here can largely be blamed for the increase in the price of food. And that has had a huge impact on inflation as well. Finally, we have corporate greed. And I know that you were wondering when I was going to get to this. It does have an impact. I'd say that in most markets, it is not a major factor. Certainly, it's not a major factor in the oil market, much as we'd love to blame corporate greed on the fact that the oil companies aren't helping us out of this mess. But certainly, it's hard to imagine in some cases where some companies, such as Starbucks, have been increasing their prices so dramatically and yet have been experiencing the greatest corporate profits that they've ever had. In fact, when you look overall, corporate profits are way up, which doesn't make sense if they were seeing their bottom line squeezed because of the fact that prices are going up for them. If they were just trying to stay ahead of the prices that are kind of pressuring them from down below by increasing their prices, then you shouldn't necessarily see corporate profits increasing by a lot. But in fact, we are seeing corporate profits increasing by a lot. So there is a certain amount of corporations taking advantage of the fact that prices are rising overall, again, largely as a result of these other factors here, but it's led to certain unscrupulous corporations seeing this as an opportunity to raise prices and basically make more money. And then there's one more thing to point out, which again, I said that was going to be the last thing, but it's also the supply chain issues, which many of you have heard a lot about. And those have been largely driven by the fact that over the last 20 or 30 years, the United States has moved to what's called just-in-time inventory in its manufacturing processes. And what that means is factories don't tend to have a lot of inventory on site. Instead, what they do is that they'll have systems set up that the suppliers of whatever they need will deliver to the factory right at the time that they need it, and that saves costs to the manufacturer. Now, these supply chain systems have become incredibly complicated given the fact that now they tend to spread around the world, certainly across North America, but also really into China, into other parts of Asia, into Europe, all over the world at this point. To say that we have a global manufacturing system would be an understatement right now. And it's a global just-in-time system. So what it depends upon is consistency, where you set that you're going to have a certain production during a certain period, and you set it up so that this other factory halfway around the world starts shipping you the goods you need as supplies to supply what you're going to produce on a certain day, and then you receive those supplies on basically on the day that you need them. But you can see where this is this complex dance that is coordinated around the world. Well, what happened when we had the COVID shutdown is literally the supply chain was shut down. And what's more is demand went to zero because people literally stopped buying things, stopped buying a lot of things. Car sales, for instance, went virtually through the floor because people just weren't driving anymore. On the other hand, there were certain things that we did end up buying more of. For example, we ended up buying more lumber because people started doing work around the house. We, of course, famously ended up buying more Pelotons because people weren't going to the gyms anymore. They wanted to be able to exercise in their homes. So these shifts in demand meant that this whole complex supply chain system had to shift over to a different set of demands that were out there. And then what happened is, as we started coming out of the COVID crisis, it accelerated so rapidly that we very quickly had to shift back. And that kind of whiplash didn't work very well with a chain that is so complex and so carefully coordinated around the world. So that certainly led to certain disruptions in our system, which then again, based upon the supply and demand curve, led to an increase in prices. But the reality is it appears that has mostly gone away. Now, as a last point, I just want to talk here a little bit about wages, because this is a thing that a lot of people point to as being a cause of inflation. And here I have to tell you, I don't think that it's a huge part of the story. The reason being that when you look at the numbers, although wages have been going up, inflation has been exceeding wages. So overall, unfortunately, myself included, by the way, American workers have been losing out as a result of inflation. This is a big problem, and our hope is that eventually we'll get caught up again. But the reality is, wages aren't pushing inflation up. So I know this has been a long video, and for those of you stuck with me, I really appreciate it. Hope you found it helpful. Hope it gave you some answers to some questions you might have about what's going on in our economy right now. As to what percentage of the blame for inflation rests with the price of oil, with how much money is in the money supply right now, or for that matter, the impact of the war in Ukraine and supply chain disruptions. You know, nobody can put an exact figure on it, but some combination of these factors are what are driving up the inflation rate right now. And what the Fed hopes to do is by essentially decreasing demand, by making money more expensive, that they're able to slow down inflation. And my guess is they're probably going to be very successful in that effort. Well, if you want to check out my other video over here where I talk about what President Biden can do to try to address the high oil prices, check out this over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.